We are not human. I don't mean this as a metaphor, nor do I mean this to sound hyperbolic in some sense. Over time, the body of a Middle Easterner has become a focal point of two different affects. Suffering on the one hand, as an expectation, and on the other, an excess of wealth due to the abundance and availability of natural resources. I say that this happened over time, as this development was based on a gradual process. An example to highlight this, ironically, are two Bacons. On the one hand, you have Roger Bacon, a 13th century polymath who was heavily influenced by the scientific achievements produced by what's known as the Islamic Golden Period between the 8th century to the 13th. Revering figures such as Al-Farabi, for him the Middle East was a hub of cultural, philosophical and scientific knowledge. A few centuries later, we see a shift in this perspective on Islam from the philosopher Francis Bacon, whose works in the 17th century around the empirical method had a significant influence on the scientific revolution in Europe. Post-Renaissance thinkers laid the foundation for European expansion around the world, and at the time, views of Islam as backwards and Middle Easterners as peoples who represented a lower point of civilization had already begun to grow. This was further developed later on by philosophers of the Enlightenment, whose understanding of humanity, which formed the basis of the liberal order, founded on freedom of expression, egalitarianism, human rights, and constitutional government based on tolerance and pluralism, historically excluded non-Europeans in their very definitions of humanity. The ethical formulations produced by philosophers such as Immanuel Kant require a consistent antagonism between reason and the senses. It is only when humans are able to forego their immediate pleasures in favor of capital accumulation that civilization can flourish. Since the non-European is seen to have a deficiency in the cognitive faculties required to delay gratification, we are perceived as having less intelligence, less reason, and thus have an inability to accumulate wealth outside of our natural resources. Such ideologies reverberated in works such as The Great Race from Madison Grant, where an evolutionary reasoning was given to this disparity in lieu of the climate, where differing conditions on Earth produced various modes of being. Colder and less fruitful climates required sacrificial modes of being, relating to countries famed for their Protestant ethic, whilst lands of abundance produced idleness and so required the intellect of Nordic races to manage their untapped resources. While this rhetoric may seem outdated, one only needs to briefly glance at the media cycles on the ongoing genocide to see it reverberated clearly in every facet of liberal ideology.
But if the Palestinians would just be peaceful, right? If they would just put down their weapons, if they had some political movement focused around an MLK or a Gandhi-like character, right? Where if they became nonviolent, there would have been a two-state solution decades ago. If we could reboot Palestinian culture overnight and confront the Jews with people who just wanted to build resorts on the Mediterranean and software companies and figure out how to get wealthy together and make it, the Singapore of the region.
Due to a perceived inability to reason, the Palestinian is consistently poised as being unable to logically do what is best for their country. The Israeli, being part of a Western lineage, have their death simply mean more because they are accepted as part of the human collective.
But this is how savages, barbarians, this is how hordes used to act. This used to be pre-medieval warfare.
While words such as barbarism, inhuman and animalistic are directed at Palestinians with such ease that it seems to roll off the tongue of many commentators without so much as a twitch from those listening, because it perfectly matches their preconceived notions.
Europe is a garden we have built a garden that the humankind has been able to build. The rest of the world, and you know very well, Federica, is not exactly a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, is a jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden. And the gardeners should take care of.
The Israeli is the beacon of hope in the jungle. Europe is a garden. Israel is an entity of the garden which is sitting in a hostile environment. The October 7th attacks are fundamentally a manifestation of this outlook. The civilized enjoying, while the echoes of the repressed attack them. The act of condemning Hamas in debates brings the individual into humanity, since they are seen to be reasonable enough, they seem to be sane enough to condemn such acts. It's almost as if it's a gatekeeping of who is and isn't allowed to reason based on this fulcrum.
Well, 20 years old, born into Gaza, which is a giant open-air jail. And what I mean by that is if my father is a fisherman and he goes too far out into the sea, he might get shot by somebody off of, the side of Israeli boats. If my mother picks the olive trees and she gets too close to the wall, she might be shot. If my little sister has, cancer and she needs treatment because there are no, facilities to do that in Gaza and I don't get the right permits, she might die. And I grow up under that oppression and that poverty and the wall comes down. Am I also strong enough or even constructed in such a way where I say, this is too far? I don't know that I am. I don't know that I am. And I just wish we had room to work through that.
This sounds so utterly offensive because it does two things. It negates the Israeli as innocent, whilst humanizing actions that are deemed barbarous. Why the West supports Israel is multifaceted, of course, but the simple answer to this question is because Israel is positioned as a colony of Western powers to promote their interests and expansion within the region. This is not hidden, nor is there any attempt to hide this fact. The West sees logic as being unemotional about facts and to be neutral in the face of death and suffering. Reason is the mainstay of their interpretive lens. The international community views on because at a subconscious level there's an understanding that there's a deserved aspect to this. In accordance with reason, any response against this is deemed to be unreasonable, in the same way that escaping slavery or wage capital is seen to be an unreasonable demand.
First, the easiest way to understand a complicated problem is to find a comparable situation about which you already know what to think. For example, if we accept that October 7th was a terrorist attack, as I believe most people do, the obvious approach would be to compare it to other terrorist attacks in recent history. That, as it happens, is impossible, because on a proportionate basis, the Western world has never experienced an attack on this scale. If we take 9/11, the most impactful terrorist attack in living memory,
many liberal commentators equate any reflection about October 7th as being made in response to any other Western country. The example often given is, if Mexico were to do this to America, what would the response be? The contradiction in this, of course, is rife, but it's important to remember that the November 2022 Israeli elections surprised many both within the country and around the world because it was the first time where a united bloc of parties from the right, led by Netanyahu, managed to secure a solid majority. The main focus of the new coalition, composed of ultra-Orthodox nationalists and radical religious Zionist parties, was a comprehensive judicial overhaul aimed at reducing the authority of the Supreme Court while strengthening the power of the executive branch. Liberal democratic principles in decline even within the beacon of hope, supposedly, that is Israel. Zionism is a movement whose primary aim was to displace Palestinians from their land and to destroy them as a viable society with the backing of European powers. The ethical discourse of Zionist thought from this perspective is a mere ideological justification for this process of organized and systematic displacement. To celebrate liberal or traditional Jewish ideals in these circumstances is impossible, yet this contradiction remains. I highlight this contradiction to make a further point, which is that the consistent reference to something like anti-Semitism as being one and the same as anti-Zionism is a fundamentally unreasonable statement. Any investigation into this claim will quickly show the historical and lived errors of the claim itself. Yet this is defended as if it is an obvious and reasonable assertion by those very forces that feel as though they are ambassadors of truth and reason. It's an uneven playing field from the get-go. Even if you are a master at their game, they will simply change the rules. There has to be a consistent and constant reminder that as much as they claim this to be true, reason is not a European tool of inquiry. And the ongoing genocide is a reminder, one of many, that Western powers are in fact the least objective and the least reasonable among us.